The night Elias Crow buried his mother, he learned that silence could be sharper than any scream, because as the coffins sank into the wet earth and rain blurred the faces around him, a sealed envelope slipped into his trembling hand by a stranger who never met his eyes. And inside that envelope was a single sentence written in his mother's handwriting that shattered everything he believed about his family. "If you are reading this, I am already dead, and the man you call father made sure of it." Before the weight of those words could fully settle in his chest, before grief could even turn into anger, let me pause you right here and ask you something important. Tell me in the comments where you are watching this from and what time it is there right now, because this story will travel across places, years, and bloodlines, and I want to know where it reaches you from. Elias stood frozen as thunder rolled above the cemetery, his younger sister Mara clinging to his arm, her eyes red and hollow, while their father Victor Crow accepted condolences with practiced dignity, his black suit flawless, his voice calm, his grief perfectly measured like everything else in his life. And that was when Elias realized the most terrifying thing of all was not death, but how convincingly some people could perform innocence. The letter burned in his pocket all through the wake, through the murmured prayers, through the slow procession of family friends who praised Victor as a devoted husband and respected businessman, and through the moment Victor rested a hand on Elias's shoulder and whispered that now Elias was the man of the house. A sentence that felt less like comfort and more like a claim. That night, when the house finally emptied and the halls echoed with the absence of their mother's presence, Elias locked himself in his childhood room and read the letter again, then again, until the paper felt softer than fabric from the way his fingers rubbed against it, and with every reading new memories surfaced, moments he once dismissed as ordinary but now glowed with a terrible clarity. His mother flinching at Victor's footsteps, the way she stopped laughing mid-sentence whenever he entered the room, the unexplained bruises she blamed on clumsiness, the sudden silence whenever Elias asked about her past. The letter was short but heavy, telling Elias that Victor had built his empire on stolen land, forged documents, and the quiet removal of anyone who stood in his way, including family, and that she stayed silent for years not out of weakness but to protect her children, waiting for the right moment that never came, until her heart finally gave out under a pressure that no one saw but her. By dawn, Elias did not cry anymore. Grief had sharpened into something colder, something focused, and he understood that whatever killed his mother did not end with her. It lived on in the walls of that house, in Victor's accounts, in the fear that still controlled Mara. And if justice was ever going to exist for their family, it would not arrive wearing a uniform or carrying a warrant. It would have to be built patiently, quietly, and from the inside. Over the following weeks, Elias became a shadow in his own home, watching Victor with a new set of eyes, noticing how he monitored every call, how he controlled every expense, how employees lowered their gaze when Victor spoke, and how even grief counselors seemed intimidated by him. And while Victor believed his son was still broken and obedient, Elias began to listen instead of speak, to remember instead of forget, and to collect instead of react. He found his first crack in Victor's armor inside an old storage room behind the study, where dusty boxers held decades of documents Victor never bothered to destroy because he trusted fear more than fire. And there Elias discovered contracts signed by men who no longer existed, property transfers dated after supposed deaths, and handwritten notes that revealed a network of influence stretching from city offices to private security firms, a spiderweb built patiently over 30 years. Elias did not take anything, he only photographed, catalogued, memorized, understanding that revenge rushed was revenge ruined, and that the man who destroyed his mother would not fall from a single blow but from a collapse of his own making. At the same time, he began to change outwardly as well, playing the role Victor expected. Attending business meetings, agreeing with decisions, even defending his father in front of relatives, while inside, he built a parallel version of himself, one who trained at night, learned financial law by day, and slowly pulled Mara closer, not by telling her the truth all at once, but by reminding her of moments they shared with their mother, letting her grief find its own path toward anger, because he knew she would need to arrive there on her own if she was going to survive what came next. Victor, convinced he had complete control, began grooming Elias as his successor, granting him access to accounts and trusting him with sensitive negotiations, unaware that every password, every signature, every hidden asset Elias touched became another thread wrapped gently around Victor's future. And when Victor finally said that everything he built would one day belong to Elias, there was a smile on Elias's face that looked like pride but felt like a promise. The turning point came when Elias discovered the truth about the night his mother collapsed, hidden inside a private medical report Victor paid to bury, revealing that she had been denied emergency care for hours, while Victor finalized a deal that required her silence. And that realization did something irreversible inside Elias. It stripped away the last fragile hope that maybe the letter exaggerated, that maybe his father was capable of regret, and replaced it with certainty. From that moment on, Elias stopped seeing Victor as a father and began seeing him as a system, one that could be dismantled piece by piece, starting with trust, then reputation, then power, and finally freedom. And as the house slept under the illusion of peace, Elias sat alone at the dining table where his mother once served dinner, staring at the empty chair across from him, and whispered a vow so quiet it barely existed in the air, that by the time Victor understood what was happening, everything he believed untouchable would already be gone. Victor Crow believed control was inherited. That power flowed through blood like a birthright, and that belief was the reason he never noticed the way Elias began reshaping the world around him with the same calm precision Victor once admired in himself, because while Victor expanded contracts and tightened alliances, Elias quietly redirected loyalties, starting with the smallest, most invisible cracks. It began with people Victor underestimated: the old accountant whose hand shook when signing papers, the security chief who drank alone after midnight, the junior associate whose promotion Victor promised but never delivered, and Elias listened to them all, not with promises but with patience, offering understanding instead of authority, letting resentment surface naturally, because resentment, when guided carefully, became devotion. He learned the rhythms of Victor's empire, the way money moved like a heartbeat through shell companies, the way silence was enforced through favors instead of threats, and how Victor never destroyed evidence completely, believing fragments meant nothing without context. A flaw Elias exploited by becoming the only person who understood the full picture. Meanwhile, Mara changed too, her grief hardening into focus, her fears slowly replaced by a sharp awareness of how often Victor watched her, corrected her, steered her life away from independence, and Elias never forced the truth on her. He only placed pieces in her path: medical bills that never reached the hospital, old voicemails erased from shared accounts, the absence of police records from nights she remembered ambulances arriving. And when Mara finally asked if their mother had been murdered, Elias did not answer immediately. He only asked her if she was ready to stop being protected and start being dangerous, and the silence that followed was her answer. Together, they created a version of normal that fooled Victor completely. Family dinners resumed, laughter returned carefully measured, and Victor relaxed, convinced grief had bonded his children closer to him, unaware that what truly bonded them was purpose. Elias's plan never relied on exposure alone. He knew Victor had survived rumors before, crushed journalists, silenced witnesses, paid settlements. So, instead of attacking the man, Elias attacked the structure that made the man untouchable, beginning with reputation, seeding doubt among investors through subtle inconsistencies in reports, encouraging auditors to ask questions without providing answers, letting uncertainty grow like mold in places Victor never checked. At the same time, Elias redirected funds just enough to appear like accounting errors rather than theft, knowing Victor would punish incompetence but never suspect betrayal from his own son. And each correction Victor ordered tightened the loop further, forcing him to rely more heavily on Elias to fix problems Elias himself had created. The empire began to strain quietly, not enough to alarm the public, but enough to exhaust Victor, whose temper sharpened as control slipped, whose voice grew louder as influence weakened, and whose nights stretched longer as sleep abandoned him. Elias watched this deterioration without satisfaction, because revenge was not joy, it was work, and work required discipline. The most dangerous move came when Elias resurrected a name Victor believed erased forever, a former partner declared dead in a factory accident decades earlier. A man whose signature appeared on some of the oldest contracts Elias uncovered, and through private investigators and careful digital reconstruction, Elias proved the man had not died. He had been imprisoned under a false identity, his existence erased legally while his body remained alive, and when Elias finally visited him, the man wept not from fear but from relief, because someone remembered he existed. Elias did not promise freedom, he promised truth, and that was enough. As pressure mounted, Victor sensed a shift he could not identify, a wrongness in the air, and his paranoia turned inward, interrogating employees, cutting privileges, tightening surveillance, a response that only accelerated the collapse, because fear exposed cracks faster than curiosity ever could. The first public fracture appeared when a routine regulatory review uncovered conflicting ownership claims on key properties, triggering an investigation Victor could not stop without revealing more. And as media attention grew, Elias stepped forward as the calm, competent heir, speaking reassuringly, offering transparency, gaining public trust, while Victor retreated into defensiveness, his authority undermined by his own reactions. At home, the dynamic inverted completely. Victor now questioned Elias's decisions, while Elias calmly corrected him with data and timelines, presenting solutions Victor had no choice but to accept. And in those moments, Victor began to feel what Elias had felt for years, the quiet terror of realizing the person across from you understood the game better than you ever did. Mara played her role flawlessly, volunteering for charities connected to their mother's name, reviving memories Victor hoped would remain buried. gently reminding donors and journalists of a woman who sacrificed everything for family, subtly reframing the narrative from grieving widow to silenced victim, and Victor, unable to object without appearing cruel, allowed it, unaware that public sympathy was being redirected away from him. The breaking point arrived not with a confrontation but with an invitation. A private board meeting Victor insisted Elias attend alone, intending to reassert dominance, only to find that every seat around the table was filled with people who now trusted Elias more than him. And as discussions unfolded, Victor realized decisions were being made without his approval. His objections acknowledged politely and then ignored, his authority reduced to a formality. When the meeting ended, Elias remained behind, watching Victor sit alone in a room he once commanded, and for the first time, Victor looked at his son not as an extension of himself but as a separate force, and fear crossed his face briefly before pride forced it away. That night, Victor confronted Elias, accusing him of manipulation, betrayal, and ambition, and Elias listened silently until Victor finished, then calmly placed the sealed envelope on the table. The letter written by a woman Victor claimed to love, and said nothing, because silence, Elias had learned, was sharper than any scream. Victor did not deny it, he could not, and in that moment, something inside him broke permanently, not remorse, but the certainty of invincibility, replaced by the understanding that the son he molded had become the judge he could not escape. As Victor stormed away, Elias knew the end was approaching, not with violence or public humiliation, but with inevitability, because systems, once exposed to light, collapsed under their own weight, and the final act would not require Elias to strike at all, only to stop holding things together. By the time Victor Crow understood that survival was no longer guaranteed, the world he ruled had already learned how to function without him, and that realization unsettled him more deeply than any accusation ever could, because power, once exposed as unnecessary, lost its meaning. He moved through his days like a man walking inside a glass maze, seeing familiar faces but sensing distance where obedience once lived. And every decision he made now required confirmation from Elias, who never refused him directly, never argued loudly, never showed triumph, but instead responded with calm logic that made Victor feel irrational, outdated, and slowly irrelevant. The investigation expanded quietly, regulators digging into transactions that stretched back decades, uncovering inconsistencies Victor could not explain without implicating himself further. And each discovery was framed as oversight, as poor management, as an empire grown too fast for one man to control, a narrative Elias encouraged because it stripped Victor of villainy and replaced it with incompetence, which was far more damaging. Victor attempted countermeasures, reaching out to old allies, but found calls unanswered, meetings postponed, favors expired, and when he demanded explanations, he was met with polite sympathy instead of fear, a shift that left him restless and volatile. At home, the house transformed into a battlefield of quiet glances and unspoken calculations, Mara moving freely now, making choices Victor once dictated, her independence both confusing and infuriating to him, and when he tried to assert authority, she looked at him not with defiance but with clarity, as though seeing him clearly for the first time, and that gaze unsettled him more than anger ever had. Elias, meanwhile, prepared for the most delicate phase, the one that required no witnesses and no announcements, only timing. Because the final collapse of a powerful figure never came from a single event but from the convergence of many truths arriving at once. He arranged for the imprisoned former partner to be released under a legal review that questioned the validity of his identity erasure, a process that moved slowly but publicly, and the media, hungry for stories of injustice, began connecting dots. Victor spent a lifetime separating. Questions surfaced about how many others disappeared quietly, how many lives were altered for the sake of expansion, and Victor, watching interviews from his private office, realized the past he believed buried was rising without anyone directly accusing him, which made defense impossible. The strain took a visible toll, his hands trembling, his voice cracking during meetings, his sleep reduced to shallow fragments, and when he finally sought medical help, Elias ensured the doctor he saw was independent, thorough, and impossible to influence, because truth, once spoken aloud, had a momentum of its own. The diagnosis was not fatal, but it was limiting. Stress-induced conditions that required rest, delegation, and reduced involvement, and for Victor, stepping back felt worse than death, yet he had no choice, and in that forced absence, Elias assumed full operational control with board approval, transforming temporary authority into permanent leadership under the guise of responsibility. As Elias restructured the company, he did not erase Victor's name immediately. He allowed it to fade naturally, rebranding divisions, modernizing leadership, positioning himself as the future rather than Victor as the past, and the public embraced the transition eagerly, hungry for renewal, unaware that what they witnessed was not a takeover but a release. The most painful blow came quietly when Victor discovered his personal assets were frozen pending investigation. A legal move justified by oversight but initiated by information Elias placed strategically, and for the first time in his life, Victor felt vulnerable in a way money could not solve. He confronted Elias again, this time, not with anger, but with desperation, asking what he wanted, offering apologies that sounded rehearsed, bargaining with promises of inheritance and reconciliation, and Elias listened, feeling the weight of years press against his chest, but he did not accept or reject. He simply stated that the truth no longer required his participation. That answer haunted Victor, because it meant Elias no longer needed anything from him. Not love, not approval, not even revenge, and that realization stripped Victor of relevance more thoroughly than prison ever could. As proceedings advanced, testimonies accumulated, not dramatic confessions but measured statements from people who once depended on Victor and now found safety in distance, and the pattern became undeniable, a legacy built on coercion disguised as opportunity. Mara testified too, not accusing directly, but recounting memories of fear, silence, and absence, describing a household ruled by control rather than care, and the public listened, not because she cried, but because she did not. Victor watched from a private room as his daughter spoke with composure, realizing the children he believed he owned had become individuals beyond his reach, and that loss hollowed him in ways consequences never could. When the ruling finally came, it was not dramatic, no handcuffs, no shouted verdicts, only restrictions, sanctions, and a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing that dismantled Victor's remaining influence, leaving him free in body but imprisoned by irrelevance. Elias stood outside the courthouse afterward, surrounded by journalists who asked how it felt to inherit a broken empire, and he answered calmly that inheritance was not about what you received, but what you chose to repair. That night, Elias returned home alone, walking through rooms filled with memories that no longer controlled him, and in his mother's old room, he placed the letter back into its envelope and locked it away. Not as a weapon, but as a reminder of why silence could never again be mistaken for peace. The revenge he planned was complete, not because Victor suffered visibly, but because the system Victor built could no longer produce another version of him, and that, Elias knew, was the only ending that mattered. When Victor Crow retreated from public life, the world assumed the story was finished, that a powerful man had simply aged out of relevance. But for Elias, the most dangerous phase had just begun, because men like Victor did not surrender, they adapted, and adaptation, when stripped of authority, often turned into obsession. Victor moved into a smaller estate outside the city, officially for health reasons, unofficially because isolation offered privacy. And in that quiet distance he began reconstructing his version of events, convincing himself that Elias had betrayed him, not for justice but for ambition, a belief that allowed Victor to reclaim a sense of moral superiority he could not survive without. Elias sensed this shift immediately, not through words but through patterns, the sudden resurfacing of old contacts Victor should not have been able to reach, anonymous legal motions challenging earlier rulings, quiet attempts to regain control over assets frozen but not yet redistributed. All moves subtle enough to avoid attention but deliberate enough to signal intent. Elias did not panic, because panic belonged to people reacting too late, and instead he expanded the perimeter of truth he had built, ensuring that every institution involved understood that any reversal would reopen doors no one wanted unlocked again. At the same time, he turned inward, focusing on Mara, whose strength during public testimony masked a deeper fracture. Years of suppressed fear now surfacing in waves of anger and doubt, and Elias understood that revenge that healed nothing simply transferred damage. So he stayed close, grounding her in routine, in choice, in the reality that their lives no longer revolved around Victor's gravity. Victor, watching this from afar, misinterpreted their unity as conspiracy rather than recovery, and that misunderstanding drove him toward his final miscalculation. Believing Elias relied too heavily on systems and public image, Victor decided to attack where neither could protect him. The private past Elias had never spoken about, the years before the empire, before marriage, before children, a period Victor believed he alone controlled the narrative of. Through intermediaries, Victor leaked fragments of Elias's early involvement in restructuring company assets, framing it as complicity rather than reform, releasing selectively edited documents that suggested Elias benefited financially from the very system he claimed to dismantle. And for a brief moment, doubt flickered in the media, questions raised, investigations requested. The same weapons Victor once used, now turned against his son. Elias did not rush to respond, because he anticipated this move long ago, understanding that the last defense of a collapsing tyrant was projection. And instead he released a full, unedited archive of his actions, timelines aligned with regulatory oversight, financial records proving restitution rather than gain, and testimonies from independent auditors who confirmed Elias acted under supervision at every stage. The contrast between selective leaks and complete transparency destroyed Victor's credibility completely, turning his final attempt into proof of malicious intent, and institutions that once hesitated now closed ranks against him. That failure broke something irreversible inside Victor because for the first time, he faced a reality where not only his power but his story was gone, replaced by a version he could not control. He withdrew further, refusing visitors, ignoring calls, and when Elias finally decided to visit him, not as a strategist but as a son closing a chapter, he found a man diminished not by punishment but by emptiness. Victor accused Elias of erasing him, of stealing his legacy, of rewriting history, and Elias responded quietly that history did not belong to those who enforced it, but to those who survived it. A truth Victor could not accept because it meant his life's work would be remembered not as achievement but as caution. The conversation ended without reconciliation, not because Elias refused it, but because Victor could not exist without dominance, and reconciliation required equality. After that meeting, Elias cut all remaining personal ties, not out of cruelty but necessity, understanding that proximity only prolonged Victor's illusion of influence. Time moved forward with relentless neutrality. The company stabilized under new leadership structures, community initiatives replaced exploitative ventures, and the name Crow gradually shifted from fear to function. A transition Elias monitored closely, knowing that reputations rebuilt too quickly risked repeating patterns. Mara began studying law, not out of vengeance but clarity, determined to protect others from systems like the one that consumed their mother. And watching her choose a future unshaped by trauma became Ilias's quiet measure of success. Victor's end came not through scandal or spectacle, but through isolation, a slow unraveling of relevance that no apology could reverse. And when news of his death arrived months later, brief and factual, Elias felt no triumph, only a strange stillness, the absence of a weight he had carried so long, he forgot it was there. At the private burial, there were no crowds, no speeches, no performance of grief. Only Elias and Mara standing together, not in forgiveness, but in closure. And as earth covered the final reminder of a man who ruled through fear, Elias understood that revenge was never about destruction. It was about interruption, breaking a cycle so thoroughly that it could not continue through another generation. Walking away from the grave, Elias did not look back, because the story that began with silence ended with choice. And choice, once reclaimed, was the only inheritance worth keeping. In the months that followed Victor Crow's death, silence settled over the family estate in a way Elias had never experienced before. Not the fearful silence of control, but a neutral quiet that allowed thoughts to finish themselves. And in that space, Elias finally confronted the last consequence of revenge, the question of who he would become once the enemy no longer existed. The world moved on quickly, headlines shifted, investigations closed, and the Crow name gradually lost its emotional charge, becoming just another corporate identity reshaped by reform. But inside Elias, time slowed, memories resurfacing now that survival no longer demanded constant vigilance. He returned often to the places tied to his mother's absence, the kitchen where her voice once filled the air, the garden she tended quietly in the early mornings, the study where Victor once ruled through intimidation, and instead of erasing these spaces, Elias chose to repurpose them, opening the house to community programs, legal aid workshops, and scholarships funded not as charity, but as restitution, because repair, he learned, required participation, not distance. Mara thrived in ways Elias never predicted, her confidence steady rather than loud, her empathy sharp without turning into softness, and as she advanced in her studies, she began assisting families, navigating legal systems designed to confuse rather than protect. And each time she returned home with a story of someone helped, Elias felt something in him realign, a sense that their mother's silence had finally transformed into action rather than pain. Yet, even as progress unfolded, Elias understood that cycles did not end simply because a villain disappeared. They ended because people refused to replicate the conditions that created them, and so he imposed limits on himself, stepping back from unchecked authority, distributing decision-making, inviting oversight, because power concentrated too comfortably began to resemble the very thing he dismantled. The true test arrived unexpectedly, when a board member suggested exploiting a regulatory loophole to increase profits, a move legal on paper but harmful in practice. And in that moment Elias felt the familiar pull of justification, the whisper that efficiency required compromise, that outcomes mattered more than methods. And he recognized Victor's voice not as memory but as temptation. Elias rejected the proposal immediately, not with anger but clarity, explaining that success measured by harm was failure delayed. And when the board pushed back, Elias resigned his executive role that same week, transferring leadership to a collective council structure he helped design. Because integrity, once negotiated, eroded quietly. The media framed his departure as mysterious, some calling it strategic, others naive. But Elias did not correct them. understanding that control over narrative was less important than control over consequence. With newfound time, Elias focused on documenting the truth, not as accusation but record, compiling testimonies, documents, and personal reflections into an archive accessible to historians and journalists, ensuring that Victor's methods could not be mythologized or minimized with time, because the greatest danger of powerful men was not their actions, but how easily their actions were forgotten. One evening, while organizing these materials, Elias discovered a final letter tucked behind an old photograph of his mother, written in a steady hand he recognized instantly, not addressed to him, but to whoever would eventually listen, explaining that silence was never obedience, it was survival, and that survival without transformation was only delay. Reading those words, Elias felt the final tension release, understanding that the revenge he carried out was never solely his own, it was a continuation of patience, inherited, refined, and redirected. Years passed, and the Crow estate transformed fully into a public foundation, its halls filled with voices Victor once excluded, its walls displaying art created by people whose stories were once erased. And in the center of the main hall, a simple plaque bore a sentence without names or dates, stating that power without accountability destroyed families before it destroyed empires. Elias often stood beneath that plaque, watching visitors read it quietly, seeing understanding flicker across unfamiliar faces, and he knew then that the story was complete, not because it ended cleanly, but because it continued differently. On the anniversary of his mother's death, Elias and Mara returned to the cemetery together, standing not in grief but recognition, acknowledging the cost of silence and the value of interruption. And as they walked away, Elias realized that revenge had not defined his life. Responsibility had. This story began with a secret buried alongside a mother, and it ended with truth made public, not through violence or spectacle, but through patience, structure, and refusal to repeat what once caused harm. And if you stayed with this journey until now, take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more stories that explore power, truth, and consequence, and comment below with your thoughts, because stories only matter when they are carried forward by those who listen.